The small town of Cedar Falls had always been proud of its pristine streets and tight-knit community, at least on the surface. However, beneath the town's polished image, a long history of systemic inequality festered. For years, the police department had been the face of the problem, a predominantly white force that operated with an unchecked sense of entitlement. When word spread that the mayor had appointed an African-American man as the new chief of police, the department's senior officers were quick to show their disdain. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Chief Elijah Harris wasn't new to this kind of resistance. At 52, with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence, he'd built a reputation as a reformer in the neighboring state. His appointment was a calculated move by the mayor, who hoped Harris could bring change to a department mired in scandals of racial profiling and abuse. But for the officers of Cedar Falls, his arrival was met with scoffs, whispers, and outright hostility. To them, he was an outsider, someone who didn't understand how things were done around here. The disrespect began subtly enough. During his first morning briefing, some officers deliberately arrived late, slouched in their seats, and whispered among themselves while Harris spoke. Their ringleader was Captain Greg Marshall, a 25-year veteran who was as much a part of the old guard as the crumbling filing cabinets in the precinct's basement. Marshall had seen many chiefs come and go, and he made it clear he didn't plan to respect this one. Harris watched him carefully during the meeting, noting every smirk and muttered comment. When it was over, he simply said, "Dismissed," his voice calm but authoritative, his eyes meeting Marshall's for a beat longer than necessary. Outside the precinct, the disrespect was less subtle. Harris's car was keyed the second week he arrived, and someone left a dead rat on his desk one morning, its lifeless body sprawled across a handwritten note that read, "Go back where you came from." He didn't flinch though. Instead, he quietly called a cleaning crew and went about his day as if nothing had happened. But behind the scenes, he was watching, observing, and making mental notes. Harris was a man who believed in strategy over reaction. The real turning point came during a heated traffic stop that went viral on social media. A white officer, Sergeant Bill Riley, had pulled over a black teenager for a minor infraction, a broken taillight. Body camera footage showed Riley escalating the situation, yelling profanities, and shoving the boy against the hood of his car despite the teenager's compliance. When Harris reviewed the footage, his jaw tightened. He called Riley into his office, handing him a suspension notice without ceremony. "What the hell is this?" Riley spat, throwing the paper onto Harris's desk. "It's called accountability," Harris replied evenly. "Get used to it." Word of the suspension spread like wildfire through the precinct, and tensions reached a boiling point. Marshall convened an unofficial meeting in the break room, where officers openly mocked Harris and questioned his authority. "He thinks he can come in here and tell us how to do our jobs," Marshall sneered. "But he doesn't know this town. He doesn't know us." What Marshall didn't know was that Harris had planted a recording device in the room, a decision he'd made after the rat incident. As he listened to the tape that night, Harris felt a pang of frustration, but also a flicker of determination. He knew he couldn't change the culture overnight, but he also knew he wasn't going to let these men, or their prejudices, drive him out. The next morning, Harris arrived at the precinct with a clipboard in hand. He announced a series of mandatory training sessions on bias, de-escalation, and community relations. The officers groaned and rolled their eyes, but Harris didn't waver. "Attendance is not optional," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marshall made a point of skipping the first session, claiming a family emergency. Harris didn't confront him directly, but he made a note to address the insubordination later. Meanwhile, Harris began spending more time in the community, meeting with residents and listening to their grievances. He attended church services, visited schools, and held town hall meetings where he spoke candidly about his vision for the department. Slowly, he began earning the trust of the people. But inside the precinct, the resistance only grew. Marshall escalated his defiance, filing a complaint with the police union and spreading rumors that Harris was planning mass firings. Some officers began dragging their feet on assignments, leaving Harris to pick up the slack. One afternoon, he overheard two rookies in the locker room joking about how long it would take to run the new chief out of town. Harris stepped into the room, his shadow stretching across the floor. "If you have something to say," he said, his voice low but firm, "say it to my face." The rookies froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Harris didn't raise his voice or repeat himself. He simply stared them down until they muttered an apology and left. But Harris's true moment of reckoning came during a drug bust that went sideways. A team led by Marshall raided a suspected stash house without proper reconnaissance, leading to a chaotic shootout that injured 2 officers and a civilian. When Harris reviewed the incident report, he saw glaring errors in planning and execution. He called a meeting the next day, gathering the entire department in the briefing room. "This operation was a failure," he began, his voice steady but unyielding. "And it was a failure because of poor leadership." He turned to Marshall, his gaze piercing. "Captain, as the ranking officer on scene, the responsibility falls on you." Marshall bristled, his face reddening. "With all due respect, Chief, we've been handling these kinds of operations long before you showed up." "And with all due respect, Captain," Harris shot back, "handling them poorly doesn't make it right." The room fell silent, the weight of Harris's words hanging in the air. Marshall clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists, but he said nothing. Harris turned back to the rest of the room. "From now on, every operation will be reviewed and approved by me personally. We will follow protocol, and we will prioritize the safety of our officers and the community. If anyone has a problem with that, my door is open." The message was clear. The old way of doing things was over. In the weeks that followed, Harris began to see cracks in the wall of resistance. A few younger officers approached him privately, expressing their support for his reforms. One even confided that he'd been uncomfortable with the department's culture for years, but hadn't known how to speak up. Harris encouraged them, telling them change was possible if they were willing to be part of the solution. Marshall, however, remained defiant. He filed another complaint with the union, accusing Harris of creating a hostile work environment. But Harris wasn't fazed. He had documented every act of insubordination, every missed training, every incident of disrespect. When the mayor called him to discuss Marshall's allegations, Harris presented his evidence in meticulous detail. The mayor was impressed and gave Harris the green light to proceed as he saw fit. Harris's next move was bold but necessary. He reorganized the department, demoting Marshall and promoting a younger, more progressive lieutenant to his position. The announcement sent shockwaves through the precinct. Marshall stormed into Harris's office, slamming the door behind him. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "No, Captain," Harris replied, his voice calm but resolute. "You made the mistake when you put your ego above the safety of this town." Marshall glared at him, his chest heaving, but he had no rebuttal. He turned and left without another word. Over time, the department began to change. The mandatory training sessions became less of a chore and more of an opportunity for growth. Harris implemented a community policing program that paired officers with local leaders to build trust and collaboration. Slowly but surely, the town began to see a difference. Complaints of racial profiling decreased, and public confidence in the department began to rise. Harris knew the battle wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always be those who resisted progress. But as he stood in the precinct one evening, watching his officers, his team, prepare for their shifts, he felt a sense of pride. He had faced the disrespect, the hostility, the outright racism, and he hadn't backed down. He had shown them who was in charge, not through force or intimidation, but through integrity, determination, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Over the months, Cedar Falls began to feel the weight of transformation. The town itself seemed to breathe differently, the long-held tension between its residents and the police slowly starting to ease. While Chief Elijah Harris maintained his steady, unflinching demeanor, the journey was far from over. The old guard of the Cedar Falls Police Department hadn't completely disappeared, and remnants of its toxic culture lingered like stubborn shadows in the corners of the precinct. Captain Greg Marshall, despite his demotion, wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background. Stripped of his authority and humiliated in front of his peers, Marshall spent his days performing his new mundane duties with a scowl permanently etched across his face. Yet he hadn't given up his vendetta. His resentment festered, and he began subtly sowing seeds of dissent among the remaining loyalists in the department. "It's only a matter of time before Harris slips up," he told Officer Riley one afternoon in the locker room. Riley, still bitter about his suspension and Harris's perceived heavy-handedness, nodded. "We just have to wait him out. He'll show his true colors sooner or later." but Harris was aware of Marshall's undercurrents. While he outwardly ignored the whispers and passive-aggressive comments, he kept a careful eye on the captain. Harris understood that change wasn't simply about instituting policies. It was about uprooting the very mindset that had allowed such a toxic culture to take root in the first place. And to do that, he needed to send a clear and undeniable message. The opportunity arose during an annual community event, a summer fair that had been a tradition in Cedar Falls for decades. The town square was bustling with activity that day. Vendors lined the streets, children ran between booths, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Harris had insisted on a strong police presence at the event, not just for safety, but to reinforce the department's new philosophy of community engagement. Officers were instructed to walk the fairgrounds, interact with attendees, and build connections. Most officers complied, some grudgingly. Yet as Harris made his rounds, he noticed a familiar face conspicuously absent. Captain Greg Marshall had been scheduled for a public assignment at the fair, but was nowhere to be found. Harris wasn't surprised. Instead of immediately confronting the issue, he allowed it to simmer, knowing Marshall would use the opportunity to disparage him further. Later that evening, Harris received a tip from a civilian that confirmed his suspicions. Marshall had been seen at a local bar during his shift, drinking with a group of officers who had also skipped the event. The chief's expression didn't change as he heard the account, but his mind raced with strategy. Marshall had crossed a line, one that couldn't be ignored. The following morning, Harris summoned Marshall into his office. The captain arrived with an air of defiance, leaning casually against the doorframe as if daring Harris to reprimand him. "You wanted to see me?" Marshall asked, his tone dripping with insolence. "Yes," Harris replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Let's talk about where you were yesterday during your assigned shift at the summer fair." Marshall smirked. "I wasn't feeling well. Figured it was better to take a breather than risk getting everyone sick." Harris nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And yet, several witnesses saw you at O'Malley's bar." The smirk on Marshall's face faltered, but only for a moment. "So what? I stopped in for a quick drink to settle my stomach. You're going to crucify me over that?" "No," Harris said calmly, "but I will hold you accountable. This isn't the first time you've undermined my authority, Captain, but it will be the last." Marshall's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means your actions yesterday were unbecoming of an officer and a breach of conduct. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending an internal investigation." Marshall shot out of his chair, his face red with anger. "You're suspending me? After everything I've done for this department? You don't have the right—" "I have every right," Harris interrupted, his voice like steel. "And if you continue to raise your voice in my office, I'll have you escorted out of the building." For a moment it seemed Marshall might explode. His fists clenched at his sides, and his chest heaved with indignation. But something in Harris's gaze, a calm, unyielding confidence, made him pause. Without another word, Marshall stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Marshall's suspension sent shockwaves through the department. For some, it was a moment of vindication, proof that Harris wasn't afraid to tackle even the most entrenched sources of toxicity. For others, it was a warning that the chief's authority was absolute. Harris made it clear that he wasn't interested in playing games or tolerating dissent that endangered the department's mission. Meanwhile, Harris continued his work, focusing on building bridges with the community. One of his initiatives was the creation of a mentorship program for at-risk youth, pairing teenagers with officers who could provide guidance and support. Harris personally attended the program's launch, where he shared his own story of growing up in a tough neighborhood and overcoming systemic barriers. His words resonated deeply with the audience, and the program quickly gained traction. Despite these successes, Harris remained vigilant. He knew that Marshall's suspension wasn't the end of the battle. There were still officers loyal to the old guard, officers who resented the changes Harris was implementing. One such officer was Riley, who had been particularly vocal in his criticism of the chief. Riley's moment of reckoning came during a routine traffic stop. A young Hispanic couple had been pulled over for a minor infraction, and Riley's body camera footage showed him speaking to them in a condescending and aggressive manner. When the footage reached Harris's desk, he didn't hesitate. He called Riley into his office and handed him another suspension notice. "You can't be serious," Riley protested. "I was doing my job." "No," Harris replied, his voice calm but firm. You were abusing your authority. That's not the kind of policing we do anymore." Riley left the office in a fury, but the message was clear. The old ways were no longer acceptable. As the months passed, Harris began to see the fruits of his labor. Complaints against the police department continued to decline, and community relations improved significantly. More officers began embracing the new philosophy, recognizing that it wasn't just about appeasing the public, it was about doing their jobs with integrity and professionalism. One officer, a young recruit named Sarah Delgado, emerged as a rising star in the department. Delgado had initially been wary of Harris, unsure of whether his reforms would stick, but as she watched him navigate the challenges of leadership with grace and resolve, she became one of his staunchest supporters. "I've learned more from you in 6 months than I did during my entire academy training," Delgado told Harris one day after a particularly successful community event. Harris smiled, but his response was measured. "Leadership isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us. If this department succeeds, it's because every officer here made the choice to be better." Delgado nodded, inspired by his humility and vision. Back at the precinct, the fallout from Marshall's suspension reached its peak. The internal investigation uncovered a series of misconduct violations, ranging from improper use of department resources to neglect of duty. Harris brought the findings to the mayor, who supported his recommendation to terminate Marshall's employment. When the news broke, it marked the end of an era for Cedar Falls. Marshall's departure was both a symbolic and practical victory for Harris, solidifying his authority and sending a clear message that the days of unchecked power were over. But Harris didn't stop there. He began implementing a comprehensive restructuring of the department, promoting officers who had shown commitment to the new vision and offering additional training for those willing to adapt. He also partnered with outside experts to conduct an independent review of the department's policies and procedures, ensuring that systemic issues were addressed at their root. The changes weren't without resistance. Some officers chose to resign rather than adapt, and others continued to grumble in private. But Harris remained undeterred. He understood that change was a marathon, not a sprint, and he was in it for the long haul. 1 year after Harris's appointment, Cedar Falls hosted a ceremony to commemorate the progress the town had made. The event was held in the same town square where, a year earlier, Harris had faced open hostility from his own department. Now, as he stood before the crowd, he was met with applause and cheers. Harris took the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. He saw officers standing alongside community members, their unity a testament to the strides they had made together. "This isn't my victory," Harris said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's ours. It's a victory for every person in this town who believed we could be better. And it's a reminder that the work isn't over. We've taken the first steps, but the road ahead is long. Together, we can continue to build a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Harris allowed himself a small smile. He had come to Cedar Falls to make a difference, and though the journey had been arduous, he had succeeded in ways even he hadn't anticipated. The town, once divided by fear and mistrust, was beginning to heal, and Chief Elijah Harris, through his unwavering determination and integrity, had proven that leadership wasn't about power, it was about service, vision, and the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. As the ceremony concluded and the applause faded into a lively hum of conversation, Chief Elijah Harris lingered at the edge of the crowd, watching the mingling of officers and residents. For the first time in over a year, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The journey had been grueling, marked by obstacles both blatant and insidious, but the scene before him was proof that his efforts were bearing fruit. Cedar Falls, a town once plagued by division, was on a path to something better, a transformation that felt tangible in the warm smiles and handshakes exchanged around him. However, Harris knew that maintaining progress was as vital as initiating it. Change, he'd learned, had a way of triggering a pendulum effect. With each step forward, there were often forces pulling just as hard in the opposite direction. He thought of the officers who had resisted his leadership, some of whom remained within the department, their bitterness quiet but unresolved. Even now, subtle challenges surfaced, a report turned in late, a policy followed grudgingly, but Harris had become adept at addressing these issues without letting them fester. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on racist police disrespecting a new black chief? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.